Wyoming Territory, 1879. The wind was sharp that morning in Casper, stinging like truth against skin as Theodora Hale stepped off the westbound coach with nothing but a carpetbag and a name she had clung to like a lifeline. She was 27, too old for fool dreams and too young for the weight she carried. Her corset pinched, her boots ached, and her heart was a crowded room of regrets. But she stood straight, chin high, as if the dirt of her past had never touched her hem. A man waited just beyond the post office, tall and still as the fence post beside him. His coat was worn, hat tugged low. One side of his face was smooth and solemn. The other bore ridged scars that twisted from brow to jaw, old and healed but not hidden. Theodora Hale. His voice was low, sure. Steady like the earth under boot, her throat tightened. Yes, you must be Warner Tate, he nodded once. You came. I said I would. A pause passed between them, not cold, just careful. Then he stepped forward and took her bag gentle, like it might break. Stage was late, he said, turning toward the wagon. Theodora followed, swallowing the nerves that rose like smoke. She noticed the limp in his left leg, slight but there. Mail order bride, she whispered to herself, the words tasting like rust. She was not ashamed, only tired of the world that made women like her need to become one. The ride back to Warner's ranch was quiet. Miles of open land stretched in every direction, snow still clinging to the hills. His land sat nestled in a low valley, backed by pine and shadowed by the Tetons. A modest house, a barn, a corral, everything clean and quiet. He helped her down from the wagon, then stepped back, not touching her again. House is warm, you can settle in, I sleep in the bunkhouse, she blinked. You are not expecting anything tonight, his gaze held hers. I wrote you for help, not for ownership. He looked away then, toward the barn. We marry in the church next week, that gives us time. If you decide this is not what you want, I will pay for your fare wherever you wish to go. Theodora did not answer. She walked into the house alone. It was small but clean, a table set for one, a rocking chair, a Bible, quilts folded sharp, the scent of pine and wood smoke. She ran her fingers along the mantel, then sat down hard on the edge of the bed. She had not expected kindness from a man who needed a wife bad enough to send for one. She had not expected gentleness from a face marked by fire. 3 days passed with rhythm. Warner worked the ranch, mended fences, saw to his cattle. Theodora cooked, cleaned, and sewed in the afternoons. They shared quiet suppers. You do not talk much, she said one night, folding her napkin. He looked up. Used to, before the war, he tapped the side of his face. Gets in the way now. It does not bother me, a flicker behind his eyes. It bothers most, she stood. Then I am not most. That night she sat on the porch long after he had gone to the bunkhouse. The sky above was clear, stars scattered like spilled salt. She thought of Virginia, of the man who had broken her ribs and stolen her money and left her with more bruises than dreams. She had buried her past in that coach ride west, but some ghosts clung harder than others. On the 6th day, Warner brought her a gift, a horse, a soft-eyed bay mare. She is yours, he said. You should have something of your own. Theodora blinked. She is beautiful. She is gentle, strong, like you, she thought, but did not say it. That afternoon, a storm rolled in sudden and mean. The barn door slammed open, and Warner ran out to close it. Theodora followed to help. Rain soaked them both through. Inside, he tugged his shirt off to wring it out. She saw the rest of the scars, then across his back, his ribs. You were burned, she said softly. He met her gaze. Gettysburg, fire after the cannon, I do not remember much. She stepped closer. Does it hurt still? Not the skin. Her hand found his. She saw him flinch just barely and then still. I do not scare easy, she said. He looked at her then, really looked, and something settled in his eyes. Not relief, not hope, just truth. The wedding was small, the preacher from town, a neighbor couple as witnesses. Warner wore his best coat. Theodora wore blue. He held her hand during the vows, his thumb brushing hers once. Afterward he asked, "Are you sure?" She nodded. Their first night as husband and wife was quiet. No rush, no demand. He touched her only when she reached for him. His kiss was soft, unsure at first, then steady. Her hands found the unburned side of his face, then the scarred side. He let her. I never knew a man could be kind, she whispered. He kissed her forehead. I never knew a woman could stay. They built something slow but not distant. Each day she learned more of his rhythms. He watched her across the table like she was something rare. She caught him smiling when she laughed. One morning she found a carved wooden box on the nightstand. Inside, a simple silver necklace. "I made it for you," he said. She blinked back tears. "Why?" "Because you chose me." Weeks passed, spring crept in, they planted a garden, rode together, laughed even. She sang once, and he stood at the doorway just listening. He told her one night about his brother who never came home, about the fire, about the years alone. She told him about Virginia, about the man, the bruises, the fear. "I thought I was broken," she said. "You are not." He kissed her like that was fact, not comfort. That night she curled against him in bed, his arm across her waist, and whispered, "I think I am falling in love with you." He did not speak, just kissed her hair and held her tighter. And for the first time in years, she felt safe in the dark. The last of the snow vanished in the folds of the ridge by late April, and with it went the hush of winter. Creek beds swelled with meltwater, and the land around Warner's ranch softened into new color. Theodora knelt in the garden, sleeves rolled and hands sunk into the damp, cool soil as she pressed seeds into rows. Warner turned the earth beside her, his shirt damp across the shoulders, his hands steady. "You ever grow anything before?" he asked, brushing hair from his brow with the back of his wrist. She shook her head. "Just flowers in iron pots on a sill, nothing that fed a person." He looked over. "You'll be good at it." She didn't answer, but the warmth in her chest said she believed him. That evening they shelled peas by lamplight. Warner held one open, thumb pushing the pods loose. "The blacksmith in town asked if I'd take a few colts to break this summer, said he'd trade for a new plow blade." She looked up. "Do you want to?" "I want to ask you first." Her fingers stilled. "Why?" "Because you're not someone I decide things around anymore. You're someone I decide them with." Theodora swallowed, then nodded. "I think we have room for colts." 2 weeks later, a letter arrived for her at the post. Warner handed it to her without a word, then stepped away to talk to the man behind the counter. She turned the envelope over twice before opening it. The writing was unfamiliar. The name at the bottom wasn't. She read it once. Then again. Outside, the wind tossed grit across the porch boards. When Warner joined her, she folded the paper and tucked it into her sleeve. He watched her. "Bad, unfinished," she stood. "I'll be all right." That night she didn't sleep. Warner's breathing was slow beside her, his arm warm across her hip. She rose before dawn, pulled her coat on over her nightdress, and stepped outside. The sun hadn't yet crested the ridge, but the sky in the east held the faintest blush of light. Warner found her there an hour later, coffee in hand, hair tangled, feet bare. "I can fix a fire," he said quietly. "I needed air." He passed her the tin cup. She didn't drink. "My mother's sister wrote," she said. "She heard I'd gone west. She didn't say how." Warner didn't speak, only waited. "She says the man is still asking after me." "Still angry?" "You want me to send word to someone?" She looked at him, soft and fierce all at once. "No, I want to stay, but I needed to say it out loud." He nodded once, then took the cup back and drank. Later that day, she found him in the barn, oiling leather. She leaned on the door frame, arms crossed. "You don't ask questions," she said. He looked up. "I figure folks carry things until they're ready to set them down." She stepped inside, her boots echoing on the plank floor. "I think I might be ready." He set the saddle down and dusted his hands. "You tell me when." They didn't speak of it again that day. Instead, they rode out to the far pasture, followed the fence line where winter had pulled nails loose. She held the rails while he hammered, passing him iron spikes, watching the way his hands moved without hesitation. That night, she curled closer to him than usual. When he stirred in the dark, she whispered, "I want to tell you tomorrow." He kissed her shoulder once and said nothing. By midday, they sat beneath the cottonwood near the creek. She told him everything, not just the bruises, but the shame. The way silence had felt safer than truth. The years she spent shrinking herself to fit inside someone else's shadow. Warner didn't interrupt. He didn't flinch. When she finished, he reached for her hand. "None of that touches who you are now," he said. "And none of it scares me off." She let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. "Do you miss who you were before the fire?" she asked. He considered. "I miss not having to explain myself, not having to watch folks look away." I never looked away, I know. She leaned into his shoulder. The sun filtered down through the leaves, dappling her sleeve. That evening she cooked lamb with rosemary and flatbread baked on the stove. Warner set the table without being asked. He poured water into the tin cups, folded the napkins smooth. When they sat, she reached across and placed her hand over his. I love you, she said, steady as anything. He looked at her, something quiet blooming behind his eyes. I've loved you since you stood in that church in your best coat and asked for nothing but my name. He turned her hand over in his, thumb tracing the curve of her fingers. I love you, he said, and I will keep loving you every day we get. She smiled, not wide but deep. After supper he brought her a small wooden comb. He had carved it from a sliver of pine. For your hair, he said. She ran her fingers over the teeth. You made this, he shrugged. I wanted to give you something that would last. She stepped toward him, pressed a kiss to the corner of his mouth. You already did. By early May, the valley greened thick and wide, and Theodora began rising before Warner to bake bread and take the wash down to the creek. Each task steadied her, like the land was stitching her into itself one chore at a time. The ache in her hands at sundown felt earned. And when she lay beside Warner at night, her body knew peace in the quiet weight of his presence, in the way he always shifted just enough to make room for her. One afternoon, Warner returned from town later than usual, an envelope in his vest pocket and dust clinging to his boots. Sheriff pulled me aside, he said, setting his hat on the peg beside the door. Said a man came through asking about a woman with a Virginia accent. Didn't give a name. Theodora set down the sewing in her lap. What did you say? That I didn't know any such woman. I told him I live quiet, don't pay mind to passers-by. She stood slowly. You think it was him? I don't know. But it doesn't matter. It does. No, Warner said, crossing to her. Because you're not alone anymore. Theodora swallowed hard. I never thought he'd come this far. He might not have, could have been coincidence. But if it wasn't, Warner reached for her hand. Then we'll face it. Together. Outside, the wind had turned dry and restless, pushing against the shutters like it meant to find a way in. The next morning, they rode out to the east field to check the colts. Warner had taken in 3 2-bays and a roan, all young and green-eyed with impatience. Theodora leaned against the fence, watching as he moved among them, calm and firm. His presence quieted them more than the rope in his hand ever could. You know horses better than people, don't you? She asked, brushing a curl from her cheek. Warner looked up from where he stood beside the roan. They don't lie, don't pretend to be something they're not, she nodded once. Neither do you. He met her eyes, something unreadable passing between them, and then turned back to the horse, laying a hand just behind its ear. Later, as they sat on the edge of the well with the bucket between them, she dipped a rag in the water and pressed it to the inside of her wrist. I used to imagine what kind of man I'd end up with, she said, not looking at him. Always changed, depending on how hungry I was or how bad things had gotten, but I never pictured someone like you. Warner didn't answer right away. He took the rag from her hand and wrung it out slowly. I didn't picture anyone. I thought that part of life was meant for other men. You didn't want it. I didn't think I deserved it. She reached for his hand. You do. He held her gaze, then looked away toward the hills. You make me want things I gave up hoping for. She brushed her thumb along the inside of his palm. Then take them. That night she found him on the porch, sharpening a blade with slow, careful pulls of the stone. I've been thinking, he said as she sat beside him, about building a second room on the house, something with more light. What for? Whatever you'd like. Sewing, reading. Just yours. She leaned her head against his shoulder. I'd like that. They sat in silence until the stars came out, the wind cooling into something gentler. Theodora watched the sky and thought of her mother, who used to say the world turned slow on purpose so people could catch up to themselves. I want to go into town next week, she said quietly. Warner didn't move. You sure? I don't want to hide. Not anymore. I'll ride with you, she smiled, small and sure. I know. They went on a Thursday. The streets were muddy from a storm the night before, and the general store smelled of oats and pipe tobacco. Theodora walked through the door with her head high and her hands steady, Warner just behind her. She bought fabric for curtains and a new length of ribbon for her hair. Warner paid for nails and lamp oil. No one stared, no one asked questions. The world, it seemed, had no interest in her past. As they stepped back into the sun, she turned to him. "I feel like I've stepped into my own life." He studied her, eyes soft. "You have." That night, she tied the new ribbon in her hair and met him in the kitchen with stew already ladled into bowls. He paused when he saw her, something quiet and warm flickering behind his eyes. "You look happy," he said. "I am." He reached for her hand as they sat, his touch light, reverent. Every night after that, he kissed her like the world hadn't broken either of them. And every morning, she woke beside him with the steady truth of being chosen, again and again, by the man who never asked her to be anything but herself. The days stretched longer by late May, sunlight lingering at the edges of the barn well past supper. Theodora moved through each hour with a quiet certainty, her hands busy, her steps unhurried. The air was warm enough now that the front windows stayed open, letting in the scent of pine and the faint chorus of frogs along the far creek. Warner had taken to reading aloud in the evenings, his voice rough but patient as he worked his way through the pages of a worn volume of Whitman she'd found tucked behind a stack of ledgers in the loft. She didn't know where he'd gotten the book, and he didn't offer, but he held it like it meant something. One evening, as the light slipped golden across the floorboards, she poured water into the basin by the door and said, "You ever think about hiring on another hand?" Warner didn't look up from the page. "Only if I could trust him with the horses. There's a boy in town. Sells newsprint outside the mercantile. He's maybe 13. Keeps one eye closed and the other sharp, looks hungry." He turned the page slow. "That all you noticed? He's got good shoulders, strong arms, wears boots too big for him, but he walks straight. I think he's been on his own a while." Warner closed the book and set it on the table. "You want to bring him out here?" "I want to give him a place to sleep where he won't be spit on." Warner nodded once. "We'll ride in tomorrow." They found the boy on the corner, chewing on a piece of dried apple and calling out the headlines with more bark than bite. When Theodora approached, he stepped back, wary. "I ain't stole nothing," he said, lifting his chin. She crouched to his level. "Didn't say you had." Warner stood behind her, silent. "We've got a ranch outside of town," she said. "There's work, a bed, meals regular, if you're willing." The boy narrowed his eyes. "What's the catch?" Warner spoke then, voice low. "You show up honest, you stay honest." "That's it." The boy studied them both. "Name's Ellis." They rode back with him in the bed of the wagon, legs swinging over the side. He didn't speak much that day, but at supper he said thank you with a voice too flat for his age. Theodora didn't press. Some wounds sat too deep for daylight. The next morning she found Ellis outside the barn, brushing the bay mare with a care most grown men didn't bother with. "She likes you," Theodora said, tying her apron. "She's got eyes like my little sister did," he said, not looking up. Theodora didn't answer. She simply walked over and placed a biscuit in his hand. Inside, Warner was repairing the chair leg that had started to wobble last week. She watched the way his fingers moved around the plane, precise and slow. "You always fix things yourself," she said. He didn't look up. "Used to be cheaper that way. Now I'm not sure I could let someone else." She sat beside him. "You trust me." "I do." "Then trust yourself. Let Ellis help." Warner set the tool down and looked at her. "You think I'm holding on too tight." "I think you don't know how not to." He leaned back. "You're not wrong." That afternoon, she walked with Ellis to the far edge of the pasture where the fence line had started to bow. He carried the hammer, she the nails. He didn't ask why she came instead of Warner, and she didn't offer. "You scared of staying put?" she asked after a while. Ellis squinted at the horizon. "I ain't scared of anything," she nodded. "I used to say that, too." They worked in silence after that, but when they headed back, he walked a little closer to her side. By week's end, the second room was framed. Warner had built it off the south wall, where the sun poured in just after dawn. Theodora stood in the doorway, sleeves rolled, and ran her fingers along the sill. "I thought maybe I'd keep the ledger in here," she said without turning. "Start writing down who we're becoming." Warner stepped behind her, setting his hand lightly on her back. "You think we've changed. I think we've grown into who we were meant to be." He pressed his lips against her temple. "Then it was worth every step." That night, Ellis came to the porch with a folded scrap of paper. "It's a drawing," he said, thrusting it toward Theodora. "Ain't good, but it's what I remember of my sister. You can keep it." She unfolded it carefully. The lines were rough, but the eyes were soft, and the braid down the girl's back was detailed with care. "Thank you," she said, voice catching. Ellis shrugged. "I just thought maybe she ought to be remembered somewhere good." Theodora reached for his hand and held it a moment. "She will be." Inside, Warner added another log to the fire and shut the door against the wind. They were 3 now, and though none of them had started whole, the pieces fit. Theodora curled beside Warner that night, her head against his chest, breath even. "Do you still think about the war?" she asked, voice near sleep. "Sometimes," he said, "but less since you." She traced the edge of the old scar along his collarbone. "You don't have to carry it alone." "I don't anymore." And as the wind settled outside and the lamp guttered low, they both knew that what they had built was more than safe. It was home. The garden broke open in June. Corn pushed up in tight rows, beans climbing the poles Theodora had driven herself. The soil had turned soft enough under her care that she could tell by touch when it needed water. She moved through it at sunrise, skirts tied above the knee, dirt under her nails, the air already warm with promise. Ellis had taken to riding out before breakfast, checking the lower pasture where the cattle grazed along the bend of the river. He returned one morning with a leather pouch he'd found snagged on a fence post, the silver clasp rusted but intact. "There's paper inside," he said as he handed it to Warner, "but it's gone soft with rain." Warner turned it over in his hands. "Might have been dropped by a ranch hand passing through. Could be nothing." "You want me to burn it?" Ellis asked. Warner shook his head. "No, leave it. Folks lose things, but sometimes they come back for them." After Ellis had gone inside, Theodora stepped up beside Warner. "You think someone's been close to the property?" He nodded once. "I'll take a ride down that way after supper." She didn't press further. She trusted him to see what she couldn't. That evening, she walked out to the edge of the bluff behind the house, where the land sloped gently toward the western horizon. Warner found her there just after dusk, reins in hand, dust at his collar. "Tracks," he said, "too deep for a stray." Someone rode up from the south through brush, not road. Theodora's hand tightened around the shawl at her shoulders. "You think it's him?" "I think it doesn't matter who it is. You're safe here." She turned to him. "We should be ready." "I already am." They posted no guard, raised no alarm, only moved with more care, more awareness. Ellis carried the rifle when he rode fence after that, though Warner never told him why. He didn't need to. 2 days later, a rider came up the road just before noon. Theodora stood at the kitchen window, her breath stilling as dust lifted behind a figure on a pale gelding. She recognized the tilt of his shoulders before she saw his face. Narrow, drawn tight around the eyes, the mouth cut mean. She stepped away from the window. Warner was already at the door. "I'll speak first," she said. He didn't argue. The man dismounted with a sort of practiced arrogance, like he expected the ground to meet him. He didn't knock, only stood at the bottom of the steps, hat in hand. "You've come far," Theodora said as she opened the door. He squinted. "Didn't know where else to look. You weren't where I left you." "I never belonged where you left me." He glanced past her toward the field. "You married?" "I did." He shifted his stance. "I didn't come to cause trouble. You came to remind me who I was." He looked up at her then, something uncertain flickering in his eyes. "You always had a sharp tongue. And now I have a good life, when you're not welcome in." Warner stepped onto the porch behind her, silent, steady. The man straightened. "You gonna let your wife speak for you?" Warner didn't flinch. "She doesn't need my permission." Theodora stepped forward. "There's nothing left to say. You can ride on, or you can wait for the sheriff." "But you won't step foot on this land again." He looked between them, jaw tight. "You've changed." She didn't blink. "I've healed." He stared a moment longer, then turned and mounted without another word. Dust rose behind him, and then he was gone. That night, Warner sat beside her on the porch, both of them quiet with the weight of it. "I thought I'd feel afraid," she said, "but I don't. You stood firm. I didn't do it alone." He looked out toward the darkened field. "He won't come back," she leaned into him. Even if he did, I'm not the woman he knew. That part of me is gone. Warner brushed her knuckles with his. And what part's here now, the one that chose this life, this land, this love? He turned to her, forehead against hers. Then we've both come home. They slept that night with the windows open, the breeze cool across the quilts. No dreams woke her, no shadows lingered. By late summer, the second room was finished. She filled it with scraps of muslin, a hand-cranked mending machine she'd bought from a traveling trader, and a shelf of books Warner had built from leftover pine. Ellis helped hang the curtains, his hands steadier now, his shoulders stronger. "You thinking of staying come fall?" she asked one morning as they shelled beans. "I might," he said. "Long as you'll have me, you're already part of this place." He didn't answer, just nodded and reached for another pod. On the day the first frost kissed the highest ridge, Warner took her out to the western pasture. The grass had thinned to gold and the air smelled of cedar. "I've been thinking," he said, pulling a folded paper from his coat, "about putting your name on the land deed." She blinked. "Why?" "Because it's not just mine anymore." She took the paper and held it a long moment. "You want me tied to this place. I want you tied to me, but I'll settle for both." She smiled, slow and sure. "Then let's go sign it." They rode back in silence, hands brushing each other's across the saddle horn. That night she lit the lamp in their room and stood at the window, watching the stars. "You ever wonder what comes next?" she asked. Warner came to stand behind her, arms around her waist. "We wake up, we work, we love each other, that's enough." She turned toward him. "It is, it's more than I ever thought possible." He kissed her, then not hurried, not soft but deep and certain, like the world had narrowed to this one moment and found it worth keeping. Autumn settled in with gold leaves and early dark. Theodora stitched a new quilt with Ellis, trading stories in the flicker of lamplight. Warner built a root cellar behind the house and they filled it together, hand over hand, with jars and sacks and care. Winter came gentler than the last. They celebrated Christmas with a roast hen and cider, Ellis carving a wooden whistle for her and shaping a leather strap for Warner's rifle. She gave Warner a pair of gloves she'd stitched herself, and he wore them like they were sacred. One night in January, she stood at the stove, stirring stew, and turned to him. "You ever think about children?" He glanced up from the paper he was reading. "Sometimes. I think we'd make a good home." He folded the page. "We already have." She smiled. "Then maybe we let it grow." He rose, crossed to her, and took her hands in his. "Whatever comes," he said, "we meet it together." They did. The spring that followed brought rain, and with it, green shoots and new breath. Theodora felt it first in her bones, a shift, a warmth, and then in the curve of her belly, quiet and growing. Ellis carved a cradle from scrap pine, painting it with the dust of crushed rose petals. Warner built a rocker to sit beside it. And when the baby came, one windy night in late October, Warner held her to his chest and whispered, "You've made something whole." Theodora, exhausted and glowing, reached out for his hand. "No, we did." They named her Clara for the light that never left them again. And in the quiet that followed, with fire in the hearth, wind at the window, and the weight of love all around them, they knew they had come through every shadow, and they had done it not just surviving but together and entirely at peace.